Chapter 4. A year later, Briar Hollow was a ghost town in every sense of the word. The life had been sucked out of it, leaving behind a husk of boarded-up storefronts, shattered windows, and streets choked with weeds where kids used to run screaming for candy. Main Street was a skeleton of its former self. Rusted signs creaked in the wind. The gas station stood empty, with pumps frozen in time. And the festival grounds, once alive with laughter, were a rotting scar of blood-stained dirt and splintered wood. Most of the town had fled within a week of the massacre, piling into cars with whatever they could carry, their eyes haunted as they sped toward anywhere else. Those who stayed were a mix of the stubborn, the drunk, and the downright stupid, folks too rooted, too broken, or too delusional to believe anywhere else could be safer. But none of them had forgotten. Not the screams, not the glowing eyes, not the pumpkins that ate their neighbors. The air carried a constant chill now, even in the heat of late October, and the townsfolk who remained moved like they were waiting for the axe to fall. Because it would. They knew it would. They called themselves the Hallow Men, a ragtag militia of survivors who'd lost everything and had nothing left but rage. Farmers with calloused hands and shotguns, hunters who knew how to track blood trails, ex-cops who'd watched their partners get torn apart. They'd all banded together in the year since the massacre, turning the town square into a fortress. Barricades of scrap metal and overturned trucks blocked every road in. Watchtowers, cobbled together from scaffolding and old barnwood, loomed over the streets, manned by grim-faced men with rifles and binoculars. They'd stockpiled enough ammo to start a small war, crates of shotgun shells, rifle rounds, even homemade Molotov cocktails stashed in the old hardware store. If the end of the world was coming, they'd be ready. Father Riley, the ex-priest, had gone completely feral. He'd abandoned the church's altar for its basement, where he lived like a mad hermit, surrounded by empty whiskey bottles and walls smeared with cryptic warnings painted in his own blood. The words were jagged, scrawled in a frenzy. "They come with the moon, dogs of hell, the pumpkin's hunger." His cassock hung off him like a tattered shroud, his eyes wild and bloodshot as he muttered to anyone who'd listen. "They'll be back," he'd hiss, his voice raw from booze and screaming. "The little bastards, the dogs, the pumpkins, all of it. And they won't just take the town this time. They'll take everything. Your soul, your bones, your fucking future." The Hallow Men tolerated him, partly because he'd been right last year, partly because his madness gave them something to focus on besides their own fear. But they didn't pray anymore. They loaded guns, sharpened knives, and waited for the blood moon. The return of Snort and Nacho. The night before Halloween, the sky turned wrong. The moon hung low, swollen and red, pulsing like a beating heart. The Hallow Men tolerated him, partly because he'd been right last year, partly because his madness gave them something to focus on besides their own fear. But they didn't pray anymore. They loaded guns, sharpened knives, and waited for the blood moon. The return of Snort and Nacho. The night before Halloween, the sky turned wrong. The moon hung low, swollen and red, pulsing like a beating heart. Every dog in Briar Hollow, pets, strays, even the old hounds that slept on porches, started barking, a frantic, desperate cacophony that echoed through the empty streets. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, they stopped. Dead silence. The kind that makes your skin crawl and your heart pound in your ears. Then the howling began. It wasn't just Snort and Nacho. It was hundreds of dogs, big ones, small ones, mutts, strays, their voices rising in a chilling, discordant chorus that rolled out of the woods like a storm. Their eyes lit up the tree line, glowing orange and yellow, like candles flickering in a void. The ground seemed to pulse with their approach, a low rumble that shook the boarded-up windows and rattled the nerves of every soul still in town. At the front of the pack stood Snort, bigger than before, his pug body unnaturally muscular, his fur matted with blood and dirt. His teeth were longer, sharper, glinting like knives in the moonlight, and his glowing orange eyes burned with a quiet, malevolent confidence. Nacho trotted beside him, a tiny terror in a spiked collar that looked like it had been forged in hell. The Chihuahua was frothing at the mouth, his yellow eyes wild, his body vibrating with barely contained insanity. "Miss us, fuckers!" he shrieked, his voice piercing the night like a blade. He spun in a circle so fast he nearly toppled over, then snapped his jaws at the air, giggling maniacally. "We're back, and this time we brought friends. Who wants to play?" Snort's tail twitched, his expression calm but predatory. "Settle down, you little psycho," he growled, his voice low and gravelly, like rocks grinding together. "We've got all night to make them scream." It started slow, deliberate, like the opening notes of a nightmare. A single pumpkin rolled down Main Street, its carved face glowing faintly, stopping dead center in front of the militia's barricade. The Hallow men froze, their rifles trained on it, fingers twitching on triggers. "Hold fire," one of them whispered, his voice shaking. "It's just a fucking pumpkin." Then it burst open, its rind splitting with a wet crack, spewing black, thorned vines like tentacles. They lashed out, wrapping around the barricade, splintering wood and bending metal. A man screamed as a vine snared his leg, dragging him to the ground, thorns tearing through his jeans and flesh. The Hallow men opened fire, their shotguns and rifles roaring, blowing the pumpkin to chunks of glowing pulp. But for every one they destroyed, 3 more rolled out of the darkness, their carved faces leering, their vines writhing like living things. And then the dogs charged. Snort led the assault, his stocky frame a blur of muscle and menace as he leapt 10 feet into the air, slamming into the first watchtower. The guard, a grizzled hunter named Tom, didn't have time to scream before Snort's jaws closed around his throat, ripping him clean off the platform. Tom's body hit the fire pit below, his scream cut short as flames engulfed him, his flesh sizzling like bacon. Snort landed on the ground, blood dripping from his muzzle, his eyes glowing brighter as he surveyed the chaos. Nacho was pure, unhinged chaos. He darted through the melee, a tiny tornado of teeth and claws, leaping onto one man's chest and tearing into his face. "Fuck your eyes! Fuck your faces!" he screamed, his voice shrill and gleeful as he bit through the man's nose, blood spraying like a fountain. "This is my Christmas!" He leapt to another, clawing at eyes, ripping at throats, cackling as he went, leaving a trail of mangled bodies in his wake. The vines were relentless, dragging screaming survivors into the woods, where the glowing faces of pumpkins lit up like jack-o'-lanterns from hell. The air was thick with the sounds of tearing flesh, snapping bones, and the wet, crunching sound of pumpkins feeding. One man, caught by a vine, was pulled into a massive pumpkin's maw, its jagged teeth clamping down on his head. His screams turned to a gurgle as his skull collapsed, brains leaking out the eye holes like gray sludge. By midnight, the town square was a slaughterhouse. The barricades were shattered, reduced to splinters and twisted metal. Bodies littered the ground, some torn in half by vines, others unrecognizable from the dog's savagery. Pumpkins latched onto corpses like parasitic helmets, chewing through skulls until they cracked open, spilling blood and bone fragments onto the pavement. The air reeked of copper, smoke, and the sickly sweet stench of rotting pumpkin flesh. Snort tore through the last barricade like it was tissue paper, his blood-soaked fur glinting in the firelight, his eyes burning like twin red suns. He didn't just kill, he performed. He dragged a body, a farmer who'd fought to the end, into the center of the square and posed it like a scarecrow, propping it against a lamppost with its arms splayed, its guts spilling out like a grotesque offering. With a claw, he carved a single word into the man's chest: mine. Nacho, meanwhile, had claimed the mayor's office as his personal playground. He perched on the desk, chewing on a severed tongue like it was a piece of jerky, his tiny jaws snapping with glee. "Best night ever!" he screamed, spitting blood as he hopped from the desk to a filing cabinet, knocking over papers and a bottle of bourbon. "These fuckers thought they could stop us! Us? We're fucking gods!" He dove back to the floor, rolling in a puddle of blood, his spiked collar glinting as he laughed. Father Riley emerged from the church, his blood-smeared cassock flapping, a shotgun in one hand and his flask in the other. "You demon bastards!" he roared, firing wildly into the pack of dogs. A stray mutt yelped and dropped, but Snort didn't even flinch. He turned, his eyes locking on to Riley, and stalked forward, his growl low and menacing. "Nice try, priest," Snort said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Your god's not home tonight." A vine shot out, wrapping around Riley's legs, yanking him to the ground. He screamed, firing another shot that went wide, as a pumpkin rolled toward him, its glowing maw opening wide. "These fuckers thought they could stop us! Us? We're fucking gods!" He dove back to the floor, rolling in a puddle of blood, his spiked collar glinting as he laughed. Father Riley emerged from the church, his blood-smeared cassock flapping, a shotgun in one hand and his flask in the other. "You demon bastards!" he roared, firing wildly into the pack of dogs. A stray mutt yelped and dropped, but Snort didn't even flinch. He turned, his eyes locking onto Riley, and stalked forward, his growl low and menacing. "Nice try, priest," Snort said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Your god's not home tonight." A vine shot out, wrapping around Riley's legs, yanking him to the ground. He screamed, firing another shot that went wide, as a pumpkin rolled toward him, its glowing maw opening wide. The last thing he saw was its teeth, snapping shut around his face. By dawn, Briar Hollow was silent. The Hollow men were dead, their fortifications reduced to smoldering ruins. The streets were a gallery of horrors, bodies strung up like decorations, vines curling through their remains like twisted garlands. Pumpkins glowed faintly along the sidewalks, their carved faces frozen in expressions of glee, agony, and hunger. The town was a husk, its lifeblood drained, its soul devoured. Snort and Nacho sat in the center of the square, surrounded by the carnage, watching the smoke rise into the pale morning sky. The pumpkins around them pulsed softly, like dying embers, their vines twitching in the dirt. Nacho licked blood from his muzzle, his eyes still wild with adrenaline. "Think they'll try again next year?" he asked, his voice hoarse from screaming. A drop of blood dripped from his tiny jaws, splattering on the ground. Snort snorted, a low, rumbling sound that shook his jowls. His eyes gleamed, his lips curling into a slow, predatory smile. "I hope so," he said. "It's no fun if they don't fight back." As the sun rose over the smoldering ruins, casting long shadows across the blood-soaked streets, Snort and Nacho stood and walked toward the woods, their army of dogs following like a furry tidal wave. The trees swallowed them, their glowing eyes fading into the darkness, leaving behind a promise written in blood. They'd be back. And next time, they'd take more than a town. Chapter 5. The Black Paw. The fires of Briar Hollow were still smoldering, their acrid smoke curling into the sky, when the stories began to spread like a plague. whispers in dive bars, panicked posts on X, grainy cell phone videos that went viral before they were scrubbed from the internet, devil dogs, pumpkin demons, talking pug from hell. The world outside Briar Hollow didn't buy it, not at first. The news spun a tidy narrative, a gas leak, a meth lab explosion, a case of mass hysteria fueled by bad cider and Halloween paranoia. Experts in suits droned on about collective delusion on CNN, while cleanup crews in hazmat suits carted away the bodies, or what was left of them. But the truth was a splinter under the skin, festering, impossible to ignore. By the time Halloween rolled around again, the world would learn what Briar Hollow already knew. This was no delusion. This was fucking real. Snort wasn't just hunting for kicks anymore. He was building something, an empire carved in blood and terror. He and Nacho moved like shadows across the countryside, leaving a trail of carnage in their wake. Small towns fell first. Rural hamlets where the screams went unheard, farming communities where the fields were left soaked red and littered with bones. Every dog they encountered, pit bulls with scarred muzzles, mangy strays scrounging in alleys, golden retrievers still wearing their suburban collars, fell under their sway. Their eyes glowed orange or yellow, their minds twisted by whatever dark force powered Snort and Nacho. Even a blind dachshund named Mr. Wiggles, who'd once been the pampered pet of a librarian, turned into a savage little bastard, ripping throats with a precision that made Nacho cackle with pride. Their pack grew, not by dozens or hundreds, but by thousands. A roiling, snarling mass of fur and teeth that swept through the night like a plague. And wherever they went, the ground churned in their wake, sprouting pumpkins, grotesque tumor-like growths that pulsed with unnatural light. Their vines burrowed into the earth, spreading like cancer, their carved faces grinning in the dark, waiting for the next blood moon to wake them. Snort led with cold, calculated menace, his glowing orange eyes scanning the horizon for the next target. Nacho was his opposite, a frenzied ball of chaos, darting ahead to scout, biting anything that moved, and screaming obscenities into the night. "We're fucking unstoppable!" he'd shriek, his spiked collar glinting as he spun in circles. "This whole country's our bitch now!" Snort's tail twitched, his voice a low growl. "Focus, you rabid little fuck. We're not just taking towns anymore, we're taking everything." Springfield was the first city to fall. Halloween night, the mall was packed. Families in costumes, kids trick-or-treating through the food court, their plastic pumpkins overflowing with candy. Teenagers in zombie makeup flirted by the pretzel stand, while parents sipped overpriced coffee and laughed about the crazy stories from Briar Hollow. The air was thick with the smell of popcorn, cinnamon, and cheap perfume. The mall speakers blaring a tinny version of Monster Mash. The music cut off mid-note, plunging the mall into darkness. Screams erupted, more annoyed than scared at first, as people fumbled for their phones. A generator hummed, and the lights flickered back on, dim and stuttering. That's when they saw Snort, standing in the middle of the food court fountain, his squat pug body dripping with water and blood, the blood moon casting a red glow through the skylight above. His eyes burned like twin furnaces, and his lips curled back to reveal teeth too long, too sharp for any dog. Nacho sat beside him, a baby's severed hand slipped over his paw like a grotesque glove, his yellow eyes wild with glee. "Attention, shitheads!" Nacho screamed, his tiny chest puffed out, his voice echoing off the tiled walls. "Trick or fucking treat!" The attack was pure, unrelenting chaos. Dogs poured in through shattered windows, a snarling tidal wave of fur and teeth. Rottweilers, Chihuahuas, mutts with matted fur, all with glowing eyes and bloodlust in their veins. Pumpkins erupted from the floor tiles, their rinds splitting open to unleash thorned vines that lashed out like whips. They wrapped around screaming shoppers, dragging them into the ceiling, where the tiles buckled and cracked, raining plaster and blood. A teenage girl in a witch costume was yanked upward, her scream cut short as a vine snapped her neck. A man in a superhero cape was pulled into a pumpkin's gaping maw, his ribs crunching as it bit down. One poor bastard, a mall cop named Gary, got dragged face first into a slushy machine. His head jammed the spout, and bright red cherry slush poured out, mixing with his blood as it sprayed across the counter. Nacho laughed so hard he choked, rolling on the floor, his tiny body shaking. "Free refills, you cocksucker!" he howled, before leaping onto a fleeing mother, sinking his teeth into her arm and dragging her down. Snort moved through the chaos with deliberate precision, his claws clicking on the tiles as he tore into anyone who got too close. A security guard raised a pistol, but Snort was faster, leaping onto his chest and ripping his throat out with a single bite. Blood sprayed across a nearby Cinnabon stand, soaking the frosting. Snort didn't stop to savor it. He was already moving, his eyes locked on the next target, his growl a low promise of death. By the time the dogs and pumpkins retreated, the food court was a slaughterhouse. Bodies hung from the skylight, vines wrapped around their limbs like grotesque marionettes. Pumpkins glowed faintly, their carved faces smeared with blood, some still chewing on severed limbs. The air reeked of copper, sugar, and death. The news called it a Halloween terror incident, a phrase that felt woefully inadequate as the body count climbed into the hundreds. The National Guard rolled in by dawn, setting up roadblocks and cordoning off the mall. Helicopters buzzed overhead, their spotlights cutting through the fog, while soldiers in riot gear tried to make sense of the carnage. They brought flamethrowers, torching the pumpkins and vines, but the flames only seemed to make them stronger, their blackened rinds splitting to birth new, more grotesque creatures. Some with multiple vine arms, some with gaping mouths that screamed as they lunged. Others that rolled under tanks and exploded like organic bombs, spraying shrapnel of bone and thorn. It didn't matter how many they killed. Snort's army grew faster than the guard could keep up. Every dead soldier's blood soaked into the ground, and from that ground sprouted more pumpkins, their roots spreading beneath the city, cracking pavement, bursting through sewers. The dogs were everywhere, leaping from rooftops, tearing through barricades, their glowing eyes a constant, inescapable terror. Springfield wasn't just a city anymore. It was a battlefield, and Snort and Nacho were winning. Then came the cultists. Humans, broken by fear or drawn by madness, who saw Snort not as a monster, but as a god. They called him the Black Paw, a name whispered in reverence and terror. They painted his snarling pug face on walls in blood and spray paint, left bowls of blood and meat on their doorsteps as offerings, and carved pumpkins with his likeness, their glowing eyes a twisted homage. Some went further, sacrificing cats, goats, even family members, children, spouses, anyone, to earn his favor. They gathered in abandoned warehouses, chanting his name, their faces smeared with ash and blood, their eyes wild with devotion. Snort didn't stop them. He let them live, for now, their worship feeding the dark energy that pulsed through him. "Useful idiots," he growled, watching a group of cultists kneel before a pumpkin altar, their hands stained red. "They'll die when I'm done with them." Nacho, on the other hand, had no patience for their bullshit. He'd bitten a few just for fun, leaving them screaming as he darted away, his spiked collar jingling. "Fucking nerds," he muttered, his tail wagging as he chewed on a cultist's severed finger. "Think they're special 'cause they kiss Snort's ass? I'll eat their fucking faces next." The worst attack yet happened underground, in the heart of a city far bigger than Springfield. A packed subway train, full of late-night commuters, tired office workers, club kids still buzzed from Halloween parties, homeless folks curled up in corners, rumbled through the tunnels. The lights flickered, a common annoyance, and the passengers barely noticed. Then they went out completely. When they flickered back on, the train was a nightmare. Hundreds of glowing eyes stared from the darkness. Dogs crammed into the cars, perched on seats, hanging from the handrails. Snort stood at the front, his blood-soaked fur glinting, his eyes burning. Nacho was on a seat, his tiny body vibrating with glee, a severed ear dangling from his jaws. The dogs hit like a tidal wave. Passengers were dragged screaming down the cars, their bodies torn apart before they could fight back. Vines ripped through the ceiling, wrapping around necks and snapping them like twigs. Blood sprayed across the windows, painting the glass red as the train screeched to a halt in the tunnel. A businessman in a suit was yanked upward, his skull crushed by a pumpkin's jagged teeth. A teenager in a hoodie was swarmed by dogs, their teeth tearing through his chest until his screams stopped. Nacho leapt from seat to seat, biting and clawing, his voice a shrill cacophony. "Who needs a fucking Metro card now, bitches?" he screamed, ripping into a woman's throat and laughing as her blood sprayed his face. When the authorities found the train hours later, the lights were still flickering. Every corpse had been posed, sitting upright, staring forward, their faces carved into crude jack-o'-lantern grins, their eyes replaced with glowing pumpkin seeds. The walls were smeared with blood, spelling out a single phrase: "All hail the Black Paw." By now, the world couldn't deny it. This wasn't a gas leak, wasn't hysteria, wasn't a terror incident. It was war, a war no one knew how to fight. News anchors broke down on live TV, sobbing as they reported the mounting death tolls. The government declared martial law, tanks rolling through cities, curfews enforced with lethal force. Halloween was banned nationwide, trick-or-treating outlawed, pumpkins confiscated and burned. But it didn't stop the dogs, didn't stop the pumpkins, didn't stop the roots spreading beneath the earth. Snort and Nacho watched the chaos unfold on a stolen TV in an abandoned convenience store, its screen flickering in the dark. Snort's eyes gleamed, his teeth glinting as he grinned. Nacho sat beside him, gnawing on a human femur, his tail wagging. "They're scared, boss," he said, spitting out a chunk of bone. "They're pissing themselves." "They should be," Snort growled, his voice low and heavy with promise. "Next year, we don't just hit a town, we hit everything." Somewhere, deep under the earth, the pumpkin roots pulsed, spreading further, curling toward new cities, new blood. The Black Paw's reign had only just begun. Chapter 6: The Last Halloween. The world thought it had seen the worst of Snort and Nacho, thought it could brace itself against the horror that had swallowed Briar Hollow and Springfield. They were wrong. Dead fucking wrong. Halloween night came again, and this time there was no hiding, no barricade strong enough, no prayers loud enough. The pumpkins didn't just grow in Briar Hollow anymore. They sprouted everywhere. Every country, every continent, every goddamn field, backyard, and empty lot. Cracked asphalt in urban sprawls, rice paddies in Asia, savannas in Africa. All of them birthed grotesque, glowing jack-o'-lanterns. Their roots burrowing deep, their carved faces leering like demons waiting to feed. The entire planet had become a pumpkin patch, and the blood moon overhead pulsed like a heart ready to burst. At exactly midnight, the world froze. Every TV, every radio, every phone, whether powered on or not, crackled to life with static, screens flickering with orange light. Then the image cleared, and there was Snort, sitting on a throne of human skulls, their empty eye sockets staring blankly at the camera. His fur was matted with blood, his glowing orange eyes burning through the screen, his lips curled back to reveal teeth that gleamed like polished knives. Nacho stood at his side, a severed ear dangling from his own like a grotesque earring, his spiked collar crusted with dried gore. The Chihuahua's yellow eyes were wild, his tiny body trembling with manic glee. "Good evening, world," Snort growled, his voice a low, guttural rumble that seemed to vibrate through every speaker, every bone. "You tried to ban Halloween. Cute. Thought you could lock your doors, burn your pumpkins, pray to your useless gods. But Halloween's not a choice anymore. It's fucking mandatory." Nacho howled with laughter, his high-pitched cackle cutting through the air like a blade. "Trick or fucking treat, Earth!" he screamed, hopping in place, his tail wagging so hard it sprayed blood across the skulls. "You're all our bitches now!" The broadcast cut to black, but the message lingered, seared into the minds of billions. The world was about to learn what Snort meant by mandatory. Times Square was a neon jungle, packed with costumed revelers despite the nationwide Halloween ban. Billboards flashed ads for soda and Broadway shows, their lights reflecting off plastic vampire fangs and glittery witch hats. Then the screens flickered, every one of them replaced with glowing jack-o'-lantern faces, their carved grins pulsing in time with the blood moon. The ground shook, a low rumble that grew into a deafening crack as the pavement split open. Taxis and buses were swallowed whole, their metal frames crumpling as pumpkin vines burst upward, thick and black, their thorns glinting like obsidian. Dogs poured into the streets, a snarling, glowing-eyed horde that tore through the crowds. Pit bulls ripped limbs from screaming tourists, Chihuahuas darted between legs to bite out throats, and mutts dragged bodies into alleyways, leaving trails of blood that glistened under the neon. A giant pumpkin, 20 feet tall, its rind cracked and oozing, rolled down Broadway like a fucking juggernaut, flattening pedestrians like bowling pins. Its carved mouth opened wide, swallowing a group of frat boys in superhero costumes, their screams muffled as its teeth crunched through bone. Snort stood atop a crushed taxi, his eyes blazing as he surveyed the chaos. "This is my city now," he growled, his voice carrying over the screams. Nacho leapt onto a billboard, tearing down an ad for a rom-com and pissing on the wreckage. "Fuck your happy endings," he shrieked, before diving back into the fray, biting a cop's face until blood sprayed like confetti. In London, Big Ben struck midnight, its chime echoing across the Thames. Then it exploded, gears and glass raining down on terrified crowds in Parliament Square. Snort leapt from the shattered clock tower, landing in the center of the square with a thud that cracked the pavement. His fur was slick with blood, his eyes glowing like twin suns. "Rule Britannia, bitch!" he snarled, his voice drowning out the screams as he tore into a group of tourists, his claws ripping through flesh like paper. Nacho was right behind him, a blur of frenzied chaos. He leapt onto a ceremonial guard, biting his face clean off in one savage snap. The bearskin hat fell, and Nacho perched it on his tiny head, strutting like a king. "Everyone look! I'm a royal fucktard like this guy!" he shrieked, dancing in circles as blood pooled around him. Vines erupted from the ground, wrapping around MPs fleeing Westminster, dragging them into glowing pumpkins that chewed through their suits and skulls with wet, crunching sounds. Shibuya Crossing was a sea of people, thousands of costumed pedestrians moving like a living tide under the neon glow. Then the vines came, lashing out from storm drains and subway entrances, snaring legs and throats. Dogs ran along the train tracks, their glowing eyes a blur as they derailed cars, sending them crashing into fireballs that lit up the night. Giant jack-o'-lanterns, their rinds pulsing with orange light, climbed skyscrapers like monsters from a kaiju film, their vines shattering glass and pulling screaming office workers into their gaping maws. Snort stood atop an overturned bus, his growl shaking the air. "This is just the warm-up," he said, as a salaryman's severed head rolled past, still wearing its tie. Nacho, perched on a streetlight, laughed so hard he nearly fell off. "Look at this fucking buffet!" he screamed, diving into a group of fleeing cosplayers, his teeth tearing through their plastic armor like it was tissue paper. Washington, D.C. was a war zone. Tanks rolled down Pennsylvania Avenue, their treads grinding asphalt to dust. Flamethrowers lit up the night, soldiers firing wildly at the dogs and pumpkins that swarmed the streets. But nothing could stop the tide. Snort sat on the White House lawn, tearing through Secret Service agents like they were chew toys, his claws ripping Kevlar vests to shreds. When Air Force One tried to take off, vines shot out of the ground, wrapping around its wings and dragging it back down. The plane exploded in a massive fireball, the shockwave shattering windows across the city. Nacho stood on the White House steps, waving a severed presidential hand like a flag. "Hail to the fucking chief!" he screamed, tossing the hand into the air and catching it in his jaws. He leapt onto a soldier, biting through his helmet and into his skull, laughing as blood sprayed. Snort watched, his eyes glowing brighter, his growl a low promise of annihilation. "This is just the beginning," he said, as a pumpkin rolled past, its maw stuffed with a screaming agent's torso. What was left of humanity fought back with everything they had. Stadiums and bunkers became fortresses, packed with survivors armed with rocket launchers, chainsaws, homemade flamethrowers, anything that could kill. They fought hard, blowing pumpkins to pulp, torching vines, shooting dogs until their barrels glowed red. But every kill fed the soil, and from the soil grew more pumpkins, their roots spreading faster than the flames could burn. The dead didn't stay dead. Corpses rose, their faces carved into jack-o'-lantern grins, their eyes glowing orange as they joined the slaughter, tearing into their own kind with unnatural strength. Snort's army was unstoppable, a tidal wave of fur, teeth, and vines that swept across continents. Cities fell one by one. Paris, Moscow, Beijing, Sydney, each reduced to a smoldering graveyard of blood and pumpkin pulp. The cultists of the Black Paw grew bolder, chanting Snort's name in the streets, sacrificing their own to swell his power. Their altars were everywhere now, piled with bones and blood, their hymns a twisted mockery of hope. By dawn, the world was a pyre. Cities burned on every continent, their skylines swallowed by smoke that blotted out the sun. The oceans churned red, choked with bodies and debris. Pumpkins glowed across the ruins, their vines curling through shattered buildings, their carved faces laughing in the dark. Snort stood on a mountain of corpses, his fur caked with blood, his eyes burning as he stared at the horizon. The world was his now, a kingdom of death and fire. Nacho, covered head to toe in gore, wagged his tail beside him, his spiked collar glinting in the orange light. "We win! We fucking win!" he screamed, leaping onto a corpse and tearing into it with glee. Snort's lips curled into a grim smile. "It's done," he growled, his voice carrying over the smoldering ruins. The pumpkins glowed brighter, their light pulsing in time with the blood moon, until the entire world was bathed in orange. Then, with a deafening roar that shook the earth, the light flared blindingly, and the planet went dark. The last thing anyone heard, echoing through the void, was Nacho's tiny, high-pitched voice screaming, "See you next Halloween, cocksuckers!"